where we left off last week. And in this book, we're going to plod through it. We're actually plodding through it a little slowly because of just how much information there is in this chapter. You're talking about hundreds of years worth of information that God is laying out for Daniel before these things ever take place. And that is what's so amazing about this, that when we see these things laid out and then we compare them to history, we don't have to make a lot of stretches to see that God was true in his word. In fact, we don't have to stretch at all. He really gets very specific. And again, God was so specific in this chapter that this is one of the chapters that skeptics of Scripture point to say that that it must have been written after these things. But we will talk again briefly about a proof that that's not the case. That these words were translated into Greek from Hebrew just 150 years or so after Daniel's time, and all of this had been written down when that took place. And so, moving forward, it was in black and white, if you will, preserved for future times. So there is if you don't trust the words of Christ that Daniel was a prophet, then you can see that there are external evidences to prove this. So let's do this. Let's get into Daniel chapter 11. We're just going to read tonight verses 1 through 21. We got through verse 5 or 6 last week, and we'll pick up from there. But we'll go ahead and read Daniel chapter 11, verse 1 through 21. The Bible says, "In the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to strengthen and protect him. And now I will tell you the truth." Remember, this is the angel or whoever it was that was talking to Daniel. And so he's just saying, look, I've been here since the beginning of this empire. Now I'm going to tell you the truth of what's going to come on now. 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the 4th will be far richer than the others. By the power he gains through his riches, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. Then a warrior king will arise, and he will rule a vast realm and do whatever he wants. But as soon as he is established, his kingdom will be broken up and divided to the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his descendants. It will not be the same kingdom that he ruled, because his kingdom will be uprooted and will go to others besides them. The king of the south will grow powerful, but one of his commanders will grow more powerful and will rule a kingdom greater than his. Now, in verse 5, remember we transitioned to talking about the kings of the north and the south. He's talking about in relation to Israel. The nation of Israel becomes a buffer state between these two factions of the Greek Empire. This kingdom that gets called Syria often, and then the south called Egypt. And so as these kings begin to kind of have animosity to one another over the course of the years, Israel becomes a stomping ground and just gets trampled underfoot. And we'll actually see some atrocities leveled against Israel in Israel before we ever get to some of these huge atrocities. So he goes on to say in verse 6, "After some years they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will go to the king of the north to seal the agreement. She will not retain power, and his strength will not endure. She will be given up together with her entourage, her father, and the one who supported her during those times. In the place of the king of the south, one from her family will rise up, come against the army, and enter the fortress of the king of the north. He will take action against them and triumph. He will even take their gods captive to Egypt with their metal images and their precious articles of silver and gold. For some years he will stay away from the king of the north, who will enter the kingdom of the king of the south, and then return to his own land. His sons will mobilize for war and assemble a large number of armed forces. They will advance, sweeping through like a flood, and will again wage war as far as his fortress." This is his sons being the king of the north's sons, and we'll talk about that in a moment. "Infuriated, the king of the south will march out to fight with the king of the north, who will raise a large army, but they will be handed over to his enemy. When the army is carried off, he will become arrogant and cause tens of thousands to fall, but he will not triumph. The king of the north will again raise a multitude larger than the first, and after some years he will advance with a great army and many supplies. In those times, many will rise up against the king of the south. Violent ones among your own people will assert themselves to fulfill a vision, but they will fail. Then the king of the north will come, build up a siege ramp, and capture a well-fortified city. The forces of the south will not stand. Even their select troops will not be able to resist. The king of the north who comes against him will do whatever he wants, and no one can oppose him. He will establish himself in the beautiful land with total destruction in his hand. He will resolve to come with the force of his whole kingdom and will reach an agreement with him. He will give him a daughter in marriage to destroy it, but she will not stand with him or support him. Then he will turn his attention to the coasts and the islands and capture many. But a commander will put an end to his taunting. Instead, he will turn his taunts against him. He will turn his attention back to the fortresses of his own land, but he will stumble, fall, and be no more. In his place, one will arise who will send out a tax collector for the glory of the kingdom. But within a few days he will be broken, though not in anger or in battle. In his place, a despised person will arise. Royal honors will not be given to him, but he will come during a time of peace and seize the kingdom by intrigue. So we're stopping there because next week we'll get into that despised person and who he foreshadows. In fact, that despised person foreshadows the Antichrist. And so we'll talk about all that next week because we begin to shift focus as we read about his exploits, and then we get to the end of the chapter, and the focus shifts from that time between the testaments to the time future still, and we'll see all that next week, as Lord willing, as we get into this. So here we are, Daniel chapter 11. It's a lot of king of the north, king of the south. A lot of they'll do this, they'll do that. A lot of things to try to parse out and figure out. And really, like I said last week, you need to have a history book to be able to track along with this. I just can't see this thing as good as I usually can. There we go. So remember, this is the outline for chapter 11. Verses 1 and 2, he's talking about the Persian Empire. We talked about that last week. And he talked about the kings that would rise and that sort of thing. Verses 3 and 4 is an overview of the Greek Empire, particularly what happens with Alexander the Great and afterwards in broad strokes. Then verses 5 through 35 are the divided Greek kingdom. This is what happens during those silent years between the testaments, between the time of Malachi and Matthew. These are the things that end up taking place with Greece, and then ultimately the fall of Greece to Rome. In verse 36 through 39, again, the focus shifts and we go to this willful king. We see several willful kings, or at least two of them before we get to this other willful king. But this is ultimately the individual that we call, in today's terms, the Antichrist. And then in verse 40 to 45, we get kind of an Armageddon scenario, a final battle. And so we're really looking toward the apocalypse, toward that end times. And then that will lead us into chapter 12, which outlines and lays out other situations about the end of times as well. So where we left off last week, verse 2, as we talked about, describes the kings who will be prominent in Persia after Daniel's time. He tells them there are going to be three more kings that arise, and there's going to come one that's rich enough and so rich that he decides he's going to start to really conquer, and he ends up raising the ire of Greece, and that gives way down the line to Alexander the Great, who, out of really vengeance in a lot of ways for what Persia did to Greece, he comes down into Persia and he conquers as far east as India, the edge of India. And when he gets there, they're like, look, we've got to stop conquering and start ruling. And so he goes back, sets up his capital in Babylon. He's not there long before he dies. And on his deathbed, legend says they asked him who the kingdom go to, and he said, give it to the strong. He did have some descendants, but they were killed. There was a lot of political intrigue that went on, and his kingdom was divided among four of his generals. generals. Now, the kings of the north and the south, they become the focus of the rest of the chapter, as we said. That's because that's who's affecting Israel directly. Their exploits, these two states going back and forth with one another, directly impact the area that was then, that was Israel and Judea and all those places. And as we say, a lot of times when people talk about this, they refer to what we call the northern kingdom there as Syria, kind of as a whole, and then the south as Egypt. And so that just kind of helps to not be so wordy with king of the north, king of the south, and that sort of thing. As we say, I should have waited and clicked on this first. The north of Syria and the south could be referred to as Egypt. Now, verse 5, this is what we talked about last week, describes the kings Ptolemy Soter of the south and Seleucus Nicator of the north. And we talked about what went on with them and how they, it just does exactly what verse 5 says. Nicator actually ran out of his kingdom by a guy named Antigonus up north, and he goes and takes refuge in the south. And while he's there, he helped Ptolemy, or Ptolemy, I think is how it's actually pronounced with the PT there. I don't know; it's all Greek to me, but he helped him develop a fighting force, and in doing so, he ends up leading that force back up to the northern kingdom, back up into Syria to reclaim it. And that's where verse 5 says, the king of the south will grow powerful, but one of his commanders will grow more powerful and rule a kingdom greater than his. So when Nicator goes back up in the north as his commander of his armies, he indeed takes back over this kingdom of Syria all the way, again, back almost to India. And so he ends up with this great land. So right there we see everything that God is saying just there coming to fruition. So that brings us to the next king of the south, Philadelphus, and that is highlighted in yellow because this is when the Septuagint was translated. The Septuagint is that Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. By this time, Greece had become so widespread that Greek had become the common language of the day. Israel had become Hellenized to an extent. In other words, a lot of people that were born Jews did not even speak or read Hebrew. They just were into the common language of the day, Greek. And so that led scholars and people to decide we need to translate our scriptures into Greek so that people in synagogues all over can be able to have access to them. And that's the Septuagint. Now this is, like we say, not long, about 150 years or so after the time of Daniel. Several hundred years before that, well, right here, 200 plus years, about 250 years before the time of Christ. Everything that Daniel wrote was translated to these Greek scriptures that time. There's still a lot of what Daniel has to say here in chapter 11 to come. So these were not, that it's a proof that the book of Daniel was not written after these events take place, that it was written before. So a political marriage, this is what we're told in verse 6, because after everything went on, there was a political marriage arranged between Antiochus Theos. This is the next king of the north after Nicator, and Philadelphus' daughter Bernice. They just he said, let's go. I'm going to send her to you. We're going to have peace based on this. But the thing is Theos was already married to a woman. And so he had to basically divorce her to enter into this marriage. Well, what's the old saying about a woman scorned? She was not happy about that at all. And thus begins a lot of political intrigue. Now, the thing about Theos is he decided he wanted to be with his original wife. Laodice was her name, and he wanted to go be with her. So he went to where she moved, but she basically ended up killing him. And that put her son, Seleucus Callinicus, on the throne of the kingdom of the north of Syria. So all that goes down. And Antiochus had to divorce his wife. And in verse 6 it says, the the daughter of the king of the south will go to the king of the north to seal the agreement. She will not retain power, and his strength will not endure. So see, the daughter of the king of the south does not retain power because she becomes a non-factor. And so the strength doesn't, Antiochus' strength doesn't endure. Bernice gets murdered, and so her son, Laodicea son, was put on the throne, Callinicus. Now, it actually gets pretty interesting here with this. He ends up on the throne, and thus begins a few more exploits here, and that's verses 7 through 9. So let's really quickly read verse 7 through 9. In the place of the king of the south, one from her family. Now, the one from her family is her brother. Talking about her is Bernice. Her brother, when he takes the throne, he's now out for blood because his sister was killed, and so he's going to go back, and now he's out for blood. So that's her brother. One from her family will rise up and come against the army and enter the fortress of the king of the north. He will take action against them in triumph. He will even take their gods captive to Egypt with their metal images and their precious articles of silver and gold. And for some years he will stay away from the king of the north, who will enter the kingdom of the south and then return to his own land. So what's going on there? Well, this guy Ptolemy, and I can't pronounce the Ptolemy the third is what he is, but they give these guys all nicknames that mean different things, and so that's how a lot of people will keep them separate instead of just going through like the name and the number. They'll just say your GTs is, I guess, how you pronounce that, or your Gettys. But we'll just call him Ptolemy the third for now. He goes and he invades Syria, and he absolutely overruns the whole kingdom and makes it up into Babylon. That's what he said when he made it to the fortress. He gets to the king's stronghold of Babylon. And so he's out, like I say, he's out for blood. And along the way, he's setting up garrisons, and he's setting up all of his little bases along the way and headquarters. Basically, he's claiming now these lands north of where he originally was as part of his kingdom. And so he's absolutely going up. And not only that, but he is taking all kinds of plunder. History tells us this. This isn't in scripture. This is history. 4,000 talents of gold, 40,000 talents of silver, and 2,500 idols that he brings back to Egypt with him. Look what it says in verse 8. He will even take their gods captive to Egypt with their metal images and precious articles of silver and gold. He did just that when he goes back to his capital because he's now won everything that he wants to win. Well, 2 years after all this goes down and he's back home, Seleucus decides, well, we're going to take these guys on. And he tries to amass a little army, and he goes after them and utterly fails. He goes, he gets beaten, and then he turns around and says, well, all right, well, let's just go home. So what happens in verse 9? He will enter the kingdom of the south and then return to his own land. That's exactly what he did. He got down, he took out a couple of garrisons, like he was having a little bit of success, but once he got into some more fortified areas, he absolutely did not have the manpower to win the day. Even though the kingdom had originally been bigger, this guy was a little bit weaker than the ones that had come before him, and so he didn't have the power to kind of hang on, especially when your Jertes or your Getes was so angry about the situation. Now understand, this is all history. When I start giving these names and stuff, this isn't like, now this is what will happen. This is what has happened. As Daniel's saying, this will happen. And so so Daniel is having laid out for him by God the history of everything that's going to be taking place in advance. Remember, Persia is still in power at this point when Daniel is receiving this message. Persia is not looking like they're going to fall anytime soon at all. And this is years after Daniel's dead, and this is the precision with which he's laying all these things out. So Seleucus III He's also known as Seleucus Serranus. He's Seleucus Soter. Serranus, he goes up to, he's now in control. This is the son of Callinicus. His cousin is up in Pergamum and trying to raise a ruckus. And so he says, well, I'm not putting up with this. And he goes up to Pergamum to try to take him out, and he gets killed trying to do that. So that gives rise to his brother, who is Antiochus the Great, or Antiochus the Third. He's called Antiochus the Great, and the next 8 verses are all about him. A little bit of it is about the king of the south, who was Ptolemy Philopator or Philopator. I don't know how you say it, to be honest with you. But it all sounds weird to me. But Antiochus the Great decides that he is done being the whipping boy of that kingdom to the south and his cousin, and he is ready to mop up. So verse 10 says, his sons mobilize for war and assemble a large number of forces. They will advance, sweeping through like a flood, and will again wage war as far as his fortresses. So what happens is Antiochus the Great builds up the army of the north with his brother, Callinicus, who died at Pergamum. But before he died, they began to work to really build up some armies. He was hiring people. He was getting people fired up. He was like, look, we can't do this anymore. We can't be these people anymore. So he assembles these great armies, and they begin to move, and they begin to conquer, and they begin to win back the land that in the areas that had been lost. Now, remember, through all of this, Israel is just being trampled back and forth, because a lot of Israel is that buffer state, and there's a lot of fighting that goes on in that area. So over the next few years, he goes after Ptolemy's garrisons, and he goes as far south as Gaza, where he's conquering, and that is the fortress that is referred to there in verse 10. Because Gaza is now, like, he's into Egypt. He's down in that southern kingdom, and he's in, not just in the lands of that king or in the nations of that king. He's on his actual physical turf now, down in his fortresses. So Philopator decides he's not going to be just beaten. So they go back now, and they start to fight back, and they push all the way back up into Lebanon. Well, guess what's right there on their way through all that fighting that goes on? Israel. So they're trampling over Judea and Israel and all these things just to get back, and it gets all the way up into Lebanon. In verse 11, it says, infuriated, the king of the south will march out to fight with the king of the north, who will raise a large army, but they will be handed over to his enemy. So Antiochus the Great, at this point, he did a great job, but then he loses, and so he goes back home. He got beat because of the anger that Ptolemy Philopator, I don't know how you say his name, how he fought back. So they sign a treaty and say, all right, look, let's just be done with this. Let's be done with the fighting. And on his way home south, Ptolemy takes a tour of like all the Mediterranean region and stuff. He's checking out all these islands and the coast, and he's just loving life. As he's coming back down south, he stops in Jerusalem, and he wants to go into the Holy of Holies. Well, of course, the Israelites aren't going to let him do that. The high priests aren't going to let him do that. Now, what we're told, and this is like, again, this is spoken of like from Herodotus and other historians, tell us that he was basically paralyzed there at the temple and could not move to be able to go in. So he was stricken with some type of paralysis. 12, when the army is carried off, he will become arrogant and cause tens of thousands to fall, but he will not triumph. Now, what's going on there is kind of twofold. There are some commentators that say the arrogance there is talking about Antiochus causing tens of thousands to fall and losing. But then there's something else in view. When Ptolemy gets back to Egypt, he's angry, he's humiliated, so he persecutes the Jews that are living in Egypt. There were Jews, spread out all over the world. Well, so he begins to persecute the Jews that were living in Egypt. He martyred over 40,000 Jews who refused to embrace idolatry. So tens of thousands died, but he had no triumph. It did not win him anything. He was basically a tyrant pitching a fit at this point. And that's exactly what God said would happen. That's how God said things would take place. That's what would go on. So, my mouse button. Among your own people. Who is his own people? He's talking to Daniel, remember? He's talking about there's going to be Jewish people join up with Antiochus the Great here. They will assert themselves to fulfill a vision, but they will fail. So what happens here is the king